That's why yesterday we announced support for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council and Métis Nation Saskatchewan for their pandemic response plan.
Tonight, First Nations and Métis communities in northern Saskatchewan partner with the federal government for food and pandemic supplies.
Thank you, and also a big thank you to my mother and my brother, little brother.
And high school graduates from Nunavut are honored in a virtual ceremony. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. We begin tonight in northern British Columbia, where today Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, along with BC and federal governments, signed a memorandum of understanding, entering negotiations on rights and title in the territory. Lee Wilson reports.
Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are entering negotiations 23 years after signing the historic Delgamuth-Gisdewe case, where they heard their Aboriginal rights and title existed. The MOU recognizes the traditional governance of the clan system as the holder of authority on the territory. The deal was signed today through a virtual meeting. BC Minister of Indigenous Relations Scott Fraser on the importance of the agreement.
It's been 23 years since the Delgamuth-Gisdewe court decision that moved towards recognition of rights and title for the Wet'suwet'en people, but didn't complete. You know, it's a memorandum of understanding. It's not the end, it's the beginning.
This morning, protests against the signing took place outside the office of Wet'suwet'en. Not all Wet'suwet'en feel this is a victory for the nation. Elected chiefs have been vocal that they have not been consulted. COVID-19 put restrictions on large gatherings. Bonnie George, speaking as a clan member, says the signing should be delayed.
It was at the height of the COVID-19 crisis throughout the world, and they held some clans held Zoom meetings, which some of our elders and chiefs weren't comfortable doing because this is such a huge topic, important topic, and it shouldn't be discussed through Zoom. It needs to be discussed through face-to-face.
The negotiations are scheduled for 3 months. It is unknown if it will address the Coastal GasLink project. Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have opposed the construction of a 670-kilometer natural gas pipeline. A large section runs through their territory. This agreement could lay the groundwork for future land disputes.
It's a first step towards resolving some very difficult and complicated issues around Wet'suwet'en rights and title, which have remained unresolved. Submit that by resolving these issues, we can avoid the kind of conflicts that we've seen on the land and work together, you know, not just to benefit government or the Wet'suwet'en, but for the benefit of the people, all the people who live in the region.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Smithers.
We'd like to hear what you have to say about the signing of today's Memorandum of Understanding. Here's how to continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca. Find us online at aptnnews.ca and on youtube.com/aptnnews. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest Indigenous news. Yet another activist convoy took to the streets today, this time to put an important question to federal officials. Where is Bill Blair? Critics say Canada's public safety minister has been largely absent, while the federal prison system has seen 2 inmate deaths and now more than 340 cases of COVID-19. Demonstrators brought their quote-unquote funeral procession of honking cars to Parliament Hill and other locations to symbolize the deaths they believe are coming if more inmates aren't released amid the threat of COVID-19. To Alberta, where prosecutors have dropped an appeal in the acquittal of Tasha Mack. Mack and her boyfriend Joey Cryer were found guilty of manslaughter in the death of 19-month-old Anthony Rain. Chris Stewart joins us now with the latest. Chris?
Anthony Rain was just 19 months old when a passerby found his body outside an Edmonton church in 2017. He had been outside for 3 days. He was covered in bruises. Official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Joey Cryer and his then-girlfriend, Tasha Mack, were charged with second-degree murder. Both were found guilty of manslaughter. Court of Queen's Bench Judge David Labyrinth said the Crown could not prove Cryer committed the assault, so he convicted him of manslaughter. As for Tasamac, Queen's Court Bench Judge Robert Gracier said the Crown did not prove murderous intent, but she allowed the abuse of her baby to continue. He convicted her of manslaughter. The Crown appealed Mac's conviction. They said the judge had not allowed her videotape statement to be used in court. The judge said the Crown would not introduce the statement to trial, but then they attempted to do so. Now the Crown has dropped its appeal. APTN spoke to the Crown, who said after the review, the judge did not commit any errors during the trial. Both Joey Cryer and Tasha Mack are awaiting sentencing for manslaughter. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Thanks, Chris. Back to Ottawa now, where the Prime Minister announced help today for northwestern Saskatchewan. The area is home to some of the communities hardest hit by COVID-19. Jamie Pashagumskum has more.
In his daily press conference, Justin Trudeau announced Canada has been working closely with leadership and communities in northern Saskatchewan since their outbreak.
It's become very clear that communities need this work to continue. That's why yesterday we announced support for the Meadow Lake Tribal Council and Métis Nation Saskatchewan for their pandemic response plan. Through this plan, we're partnering with communities to provide over $2.3 million for everything from food to supplies.
Tribal Chief Richard Ben of the Meadow Lake Tribal Council says food is an issue. People are locked down at home and can't leave the communities to shop for groceries. Ben says the money will be used to stockpile food and pay for security workers, among other things.
So we're going to be concentrating a lot on educating our people. We're going to probably look at putting some of it towards mental health because, as you know, a lot of our people are staying indoors, they're doing nothing and getting really stir crazy. So it takes a big toll on your mental health. So that's what we're going to look at, different ways of utilizing that money.
Glenn McCallum, president of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, says the money will also be used for things like isolation units, providing personal protection equipment, and help for the homeless. McCallum and Ben both commend Indigenous Services Canada for the response to their request for aid. McCallum and Ben say they reached out for assistance 2 to 3 weeks ago.
We like to get the elders and the vulnerable to be able to be isolated, and it takes a lot of effort when you don't have sometimes the capability or the capacity structure-wise to be able to isolate individuals, and we're working with individuals that don't have places. So there's a lot of work to be done. It costs a lot of money, and it's great for the federal government to give us those dollars to be able to do the job that needs to be done, taking care of our people.
McCallum said their situation is critical because many communities are remote and far from the nearest hospital. Ben cautions against province and regions opening up. He says this could cause a sense of false security among communities that need to continue to lock down. Jamie Pashagumskum, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Still to come, a big discrepancy in the number of Indigenous people testing positive for COVID-19. We'll talk to the author of a report on the data after the break.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamorat. Here's what we'll have for you on Nation to Nation. We speak to a residential school survivor who refuses to be forgotten. The group she represents has been left out of any kind of settlement, and that means going back to court. As well, the Yellowhead Institute released a report earlier this week. It says there are more Indigenous COVID cases than the Department of Indigenous Services is reporting. Meanwhile, Indigenous Services agrees somewhat, but cautions against using the Institute's figures as the gospel truth. That's coming up right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 18 above for Fredericton, 16 in Halifax, +2 and cloudy in Nain, 4 with snow in Happy Valley Goose Bay. Showers and 14 in Montreal, 12 for Saguenay, 18 with showers for Toronto, 15 and rain in Ottawa. A rainy day in Thunder Bay with a high of 16, 15 and rain in Wawa. -1 in Churchill, 7 above for Norway House. 16 under sunny skies in Winnipeg and Brandon. 19 above for Regina, plus 15 under sunny skies in Saskatoon. 13 in Meadow Lake, 10 for La Ronge. Welcome back. In Ontario, the financial burden of COVID-19 response efforts in Canada's most populated reserve has outpaced funding from the federal government. 6 nations of the Grand River elected chief and council have launched a fundraiser seeking help from community members and allies. They say the community cannot wait for further support from the provincial or federal governments. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller said today that an initial allocation of $2.2 million to the community should not be characterized as the total amount Canada is prepared to provide.
As to a second round or additional sums of money, this is something that we have always said. This was always the beginning of the conversation, and it is something that we are prepared to supply additional amounts for as we start to reassess need and then trace the path of the epidemic and its impact on communities.
With most schools in Canada closed by the COVID-19 pandemic, students finishing the year have to take their work online. However, things like the right equipment and reliable internet connection can be a struggle in remote communities. Daryl Stranger now on how students and teachers in northern Manitoba are trying to keep up.
Trying to complete a school year during a pandemic is not an ideal situation for any school, more so those in remote places. The Frontier School Division is huge. It covers 75% of Manitoba's land mass. Many of its schools are remote, some only accessible by air, boat, or rail. This remoteness is behind or causes many challenges, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic has sent all the students home.
Our rough guesstimates would be that we have about 50% of our students that probably have access to quality technology. I should say differently, quality connectivity. And of those 50%, I would say less than half probably have a device at their disposal that they can use very frequently.
Clausen says the school division was proactive in stocking up on devices.
Our school division purchased 1,100 laptops, and we have now shipped them out to our different schools through our 5 area offices.
However, a good laptop is useless without a solid internet connection.
Working at trying to increase the standard 5 megabytes to more capacity so that we can do more than just an email. In some of our schools in the morning, we have blocked off the internet use for everybody except the secretary to make sure all the attendance gets entered in. Those are the kinds of things that we've done.
Toby Wilson teaches at Jack River School in Norway House. She says moving classes online was new for her and her students.
We had an interview, I guess, or questionnaire right when this all happened about to parents on who had access to internet, who had access to a computer or a tablet or a phone or anything like that. And I think I only had about, I'd say 20% of my kids. I have 21 kids. So it wasn't much at all for access. So everything I do is all worksheet type based on our curriculum.
With no end in sight for COVID-19 and online teaching, there's still room for some old school technology.
So I make sure I send home like the pencils, erasers, crayons, scissors, anything that they need to complete that package.
Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
As you've been hearing, there's a major discrepancy in the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Indigenous communities that are reported by Indigenous Services Canada compared to what's happening on the ground. According to ISC, as of Wednesday, there were 185 confirmed positive cases on First Nations. But research by the Yellowhead Institute found hundreds of more cases of the virus. To explain, we're joined by Courtney Skye, who did the research for the Yellowhead Institute. Courtney, thanks for being with us. Why did you want to take a closer look at the COVID-19 data?
Well, I was noticing that there were a lot of reports in our area around Ontario, specifically Akwesasne, Ganawage, and Six Nations, where the reports for the numbers that were coming out of our community a few weeks ago made it seem like we were the only community that had any cases. If you were comparing the community reported data to that Indigenous Services was thinking about happening in communities. And that didn't make sense to me because I had seen from different news coverages that there were other communities that were reporting cases as well. And so I wanted to kind of confirm the data that was being presented by Indigenous Services Canada and just to, understand what was happening there. I work primarily as a researcher, as a policy analyst when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I know from the National Inquiry, they raised a number of issues around data collection, and they weren't able to define a clear number of Indigenous women that are missing or have murdered because the data collection isn't there. And I suspect that was likely the case also in this health information data. And so that's why it was important to me to actually compare these numbers and figures and challenge what Indigenous Services was reporting.
And so what are you finding, and what methods do you use that Indigenous Services isn't?
So Indigenous Services Canada is only reporting the number of cases that are occurring on reserve. They are not reporting cases of people that live in urban centers, and they are not reporting a fulsome Indigenous picture. They're not reporting cases around Métis or Inuit. Sometimes they'll do updates around Inuit communities, but that's separate from their total as well. And I know that, people that are First Nations and Indigenous recognize the fact that we have relationships with people that don't necessarily live on reserve. I have family that lives in urban centers. I have family that lives in the U.S. And so I'm more interested and I'm concerned about some of these other areas as well, not just exclusively what's happening on reserve, but also because there's that relationship. People that are away at school might be coming back as schools were canceled. That spread from urban centers was likely going to occur and happen into on-reserve communities. And being prepared for that, understanding, in urban centers, what Indigenous people are contracting COVID-19, what their relationships are to our communities, that's something our community should be aware of.
So what number did you arrive at, and what does the discrepancy between that number and what the government's presenting and the reality on the ground say to you?
So I was able to find about 465 cases of COVID-19 that had been reported by on-reserve communities, whether that is, by Indigenous communities. So that would include on-reserve communities, but also urban centers and the different public health agencies that are also reporting and collecting data around their communities, and then different local reports. I was also able to find 7 different people who had died because of COVID-19 that were First Nations. Right now, Indigenous Services Canada is only reporting that there have been 2 deaths when we've been able to identify 7. So it's actually 3 times as many deaths, which, people are saying, 7 isn't that many, but it's still a lot when you consider they're all recognized as elders in the community, and those communities are impacted with the loss of cultural knowledge that those elders had.
Well, Courtney, important work. Appreciate you sharing some of it with us here.
Thanks.
And for more information on that research, you can visit the Yellowhead Institute's website. Coming up, an all-new episode of APTN Investigates is set to debut tomorrow night. We've got a preview after the break. Here's the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. 17 for Grand Prairie, showers and 12 in Fort McMurray. 20 above under sunny skies in Medicine Hat, 18 in Edmonton. 18 for Vancouver, 19 in Victoria. 14 in Fort Nelson, 20 and sunny in Smithers. 7 for Old Crow, 15 above in Whitehorse. Plus 15 under sunny skies for Fort Liard and Trout Lake. Plus 1 with snow in Yellowknife. Minus 1 and snow for Sachs Harbor, 4 below with snow in Paulatuck. Minus 1 and snow for Baker Lake and Repulse Bay. Minus 3 in Resolute, 0 in Clyde River. Welcome back. It's a painful legacy in Canada. Thousands of Inuit were sent to hospitals down south to be treated for tuberculosis during the epidemics of the 1950s and 60s. Now APTN Investigates has uncovered thousands of patient letters that are being reunited with families. Here's a preview of Writing Home.
Letters, thousands of them, written by Inuit tuberculosis patients in the 1950s and 60s. More than 5,000 Inuit were treated down south. Through access to information, APTN Investigates received thousands of pages of documents and spent more than 3 years researching them, and found more than 800 patient names. Patients like Annie Anjuiak's father, Tommy Analik.
My father died in 1994. Never having talked about his time in the South, in the hospital.
He was just 26 when he left Iqaluit, then called Frobisher Bay, to go to the Hamilton Sanatorium in the South. In this letter, he writes to the Northern welfare worker, Bob Williamson.
This is July 23, 1958. To Bobby from Tommy, E286. I'm writing, I have received your letter, and thank you very much. I understand your letter very well. I'm very tired of being in a hospital. It's no place for anybody at all. Another thing is my mother is blind, and I pity her. My wife is alone, and I've been away so long. Do you understand? I want you to copy this letter and show it to the boss. All I can say is the white man's land is enough to put you out of mind. It is no good.
And APTN Investigates can search the collection of letters for your loved one. You can email producer Holly Moore at hmoore@aptn.ca. Nunavut Civic Nuksavut is a program in Ottawa where Nunavut High School graduates go to learn about the Nunavut land claim and prepare for post-secondary education. Well, COVID-19 ended this year early, but last night they got the kids back together virtually for a graduation ceremony. The grads were treated to a song by Susan Aglukark and received praise from Inuit leaders. Most importantly, a roll call of graduates. We first met this young man back in October as he started his studies. Now he's a grad.
And that's pretty much became my second home and my second family. I don't think I would have been able to do it without any of the staff or any of the friends that I made down there. I'd like to say a big thank you, and also a big thank you to my mother and my brother, older brother, for supporting me my whole life.
And congrats to the grads. It's good to see some graduations still carrying on. That's your APTN National News for this Thursday. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Stick around. Todd Lamarand is next with Nation to Nation. Have a great night.